Revenge with Karen.
I knew Lacey was going to be a problem the moment she asked if we could a/B test the warehouse schedule for vibes. Vibes. Like this was Coachella Logistics, and not a national supply chain with 3-hour SLAs and union constraints in 2 states. She twirled into that Tuesday meeting like Mary Poppins with a finance degree, clutching an iPad and some poor intern's soul. It was already 2 cups of bitter coffee deep, and 12 years past giving a damn about impressing fresh MBAs. My job wasn't to sparkle. It was to keep the building standing and the operations humming. I didn't need applause. I needed no one to notice I was there, because if they did, it meant something had gone to hell. But Lacey noticed me. Not with respect, no. With that entitled millennial contempt dressed up as disruption. "Susan, can you try not to make things sound so dire?" She chirped, after I warned that switching back-end logistics mid-Q3 without a rollback plan might collapse 3 vendor pipelines. I smiled, the way you do when someone's toddler offers to rewire your house. "Sure," I said. "Let me go rewrite the laws of physics real quick, too." And listen, I wouldn't usually pause mid-chaos to ask this, but real quick. If you're enjoying this story so far, tap that like button and consider subscribing. I promise it costs less than a Lacey-led rebranding campaign, and it means the world to the folks making these stories for you. Now, back to our scheduled implosion. The thing about being the backbone is nobody sees you until the spine cracks. My team handled vendor integrations, compliance rollouts, regional zoning workarounds, and a dozen other things nobody could even pronounce. We were the ghost in the machine, hands behind the curtain. And for years, that was fine. The founder, Lacey's father, understood the value of quiet competence. He never micromanaged, never disrespected the machinery. He just let us do our work, and in return, we kept his empire upright. But then he retired, and in walked Lacey, all hair flip hustle and Pinterest aphorisms. She'd been in strategy for 5 years at some influencer startup that sold vegan air or whatever. Suddenly, he was our interim VP of operations and acting chief transformation officer, a title that should come with a crash helmet and liability insurance. The first red flag came when she declared that ops needs to be rebranded, not restructured, rebranded, as if we were a shampoo line. She hired a brand consultant named Kyle who wore turtlenecks and used the word synergy like a comma. Together, unveiled a slideshow with fonts that gave me a migraine and charts showing how legacy systems were energetically misaligned with the company's new vision. Legacy systems, of course, meant mine. By Q1, half my weekly invites had vanished. The Slack channel, where my team tracked downtime reports, got archived without notice. A junior analyst who used to report to me was suddenly dual-aligned to Lacey's Agile implementation pod. I asked questions, got smiles, raised flags, got labeled resistant. At one point, someone from HR asked if I'd consider upskilling into a more emotionally agile role. I asked if they were firing me. They laughed like it was a joke. I didn't, so I adapted. I shrunk my digital footprint, started archiving reports privately, and told my team to keep their heads down but keep the receipts. Every API handoff, every compliance key rotation, every vendor ping that got ignored, I logged it. Not in the company's new cloud system, which Lacey had moved to some sparkly SaaS platform without redundancy, but somewhere far safer. And I started drafting a clause. Quietly, legally, the kind you bury in service contracts like a landmine in a field of tulips. It wasn't revenge. Not then. It was just insurance. A single paragraph tucked inside a routine IP migration document, reviewed and approved during one of the founder's last months, for Lacey took the reins. It stated that in the event of operational assets being deprecated or reassigned without documented technical review, full system access and control would revert to the named infrastructure officer, me. Nobody noticed, because nobody reads contracts when they're busy rebranding logistics as flow architecture. By spring, Lacey had her influencer squad running internal comms like a TikTok agency. Company's blog featured pictures of vision boards and smoothie bowls. Meanwhile, my team patched back-end outages like firefighters with duct tape. I stayed quiet, stayed useful, stayed invisible, until the day Lacey muttered 3 words that would change everything. Mute her. Now. The new ops initiative launched with a bang. Literally, a confetti cannon went off at the Monday morning town hall. Lacey stood on stage beside a neon sign that said "Future starts now," holding a branded water bottle like she just invented hydration. "We're reimagining ops," she beamed, "so we're rolling out Nexus Flow," which, from what I could gather, was a Saw-S Frankenstein that promised to replace 5 systems with one, none of which it could do well. She kept calling it one dashboard to rule them all. I kept thinking about how that line ends, with fire and screaming and Gollum falling into lava. I wasn't invited to the rollout meeting. My calendar was cleared without explanation. When I asked one of Lacey's new hires, some 25-year-old in designer sneakers, and a name tag that said Culture Architect, if there'd been a mistake, he said, "Oh, Susan, you don't need to worry about this part of the journey. This is more front-end energy." I said nothing, just smiled and made a mental note to check audit logs. The tools we'd built weren't pretty, but they worked. No lag, no fluff, no 15-second animation transitions between menus. They were fast, stable, and built specifically for our infrastructure. Nexus Flow, by contrast, was basically a flashy skin with a shaky backend and a sales rep who used the phrase "gamify your compliance protocols" with a straight face. A week into the modernization, Lacey poached one of my direct reports, a brilliant backend dev named Priya, and reassigned her to the transformation pod. No warning, no transition, just a Slack message from Priya that said, "Sorry, I didn't have a choice. I didn't blame her. She had rent to pay and a toddler at home." But that was the turning point, because that's when I stopped hoping it would blow over and started planning for the fire. The first thing I did was revoke 3 dormant admin tokens, silent, untraceable. They hadn't been used in months, but they were a backdoor into our internal modules. I no longer trusted the hands in charge. I didn't tell anyone, just pulled the plug and watched for noise. Nothing happened, which told me no one even knew those doors existed. Good. Next, I updated the external vendor handshake logs and rerouted API key refreshes through a secondary authorization node, one I controlled through an entity called Clearhill Systems. It was a small LLC I'd set up years ago for contract testing. I'd kept it alive, quietly like a spare key under the mat. Now I moved the mat. Meanwhile, morale slid like a greased bowling ball. Tickets doubled, response times tripled. Half of Nexus Flow's fancy widgets didn't work with our inventory schema, and the shipping sync started skipping line items. Customer service began logging 2 a.m. complaints about phantom orders and vanishing tracking numbers. Every time someone asked what was going on, Lacey held a new webinar about mindset pivoting. Translation: don't question her, just visualize solutions harder. The kicker came Thursday. A performance and culture liaison pulled me aside, same kid who told me I wasn't part of the journey, and said, "Leadership's been talking, and they think your tone has been a bit heavy lately. It's hurting the vibe. Maybe try being more solutions forward." I swear, took every cell in my body not to explain how their solutions were forward, backward, and sideways into a compliance violation. I nodded, went home, and that night I retrieved the envelope. It had been sitting in my filing cabinet for months, sealed, signed, and notarized. Inside was a trigger doc, a formal activation of the reversion clause I'd embedded into our infrastructure service agreement back when we migrated from external cloud vendors to internal hosting. The clause stated that any unapproved deprecation of core systems would transfer operational rights, including intellectual property, to a third-party trust, mine. I placed the envelope in a fireproof safe next to my grandmother's will and a photo of my old dog, Jasper. And then I did something I hadn't done in years. I slept like a baby. It was supposed to be a formality, just a quarterly investor call to check boxes and parade buzzwords. Nexus Flow this, Synergy that. The script was tight, the lighting perfect, and Lacey had even made her team rehearse their camera-ready presence the day before, complete with ring lights and soft-focus backgrounds. Her version of strategy was image over integrity, optics over operations. And for the past month, I'd said nothing, until she lied. The slide deck was rolling. "Our operational pipeline is fully modernized," Lacey chirped, gesturing at some colorful chart that looked like it had been made in Canva by a drunk intern. "We've sunsetted all legacy dependencies and transitioned to a modular, compliance-agnostic architecture." Compliance-agnostic. My jaw actually twitched. I unmuted myself. "With respect," I said calmly, "that's not accurate. The warehouse routing module still runs on Ops Core, and the Nexus handoff doesn't meet the security requirement for timestamp integrity. Lacey's eyes went wide, then narrowed. Mute her, she snapped. One of her people, probably that culture architect, fumbled at the controls. A beat later, my mic went dead, and that right there was the threshold. She didn't correct me, didn't ask for clarification, didn't say, let's take it offline or we'll follow up with details. She silenced me, in front of investors, in front of my team, with a smirk on her face and a voice that cracked like a whip. Not because I was wrong, because I was inconvenient. So I leaned back, calm, measured, reached off screen and held up the envelope. Just a plain thing, cream-colored, no logo, no label, no hint of the detonation it contained. Lacey looked at it, blinked, and kept talking like it was nothing. But a few investors paused. One even tilted his head like he sensed something but didn't know what. I looked straight at the camera, gave a polite smile, just a hint of something behind the eyes, and logged off. Click. Silence. My laptop screen dimmed. My heartbeat didn't. I stood up from the dining table I'd converted into a war desk months ago. Sunlight leaked through the blinds, slicing the room into sharp angles. Coffee had gone cold. Jasper's old collar still hung by the window, a quiet reminder of simpler loyalties. Internally, something ancient and quiet clicked into gear. A part of me I hadn't used in years, long buried under deadlines and diplomacy, turned on like a generator during a blackout. That envelope wasn't some empty gesture or passive-aggressive stunt. It was the notarized, timestamp trigger for Clause 14.1c of the Ops Transition Protocol. The one that quietly reassigned all operational access keys, system recovery rights, and infrastructure oversight to my trust if certain conditions were met, namely, unilateral system reassignment without documented engineering review. Lacey had met those conditions 2 weeks ago, and I'd activated the clause the moment she muted me. Because that's the kicker. The clause was enforced not through emotion or argument, but through timing, through logs, through exact legal language tied to user action. My microphone being disabled on a corporate call in direct response to me flagging a compliance issue, constituted what the clause called functional removal of technical authority without cause. That phrase, buried on page 12 of a vendor transition memo, was about to cost them millions. But in that moment, I wasn't angry. I was still like the eye of a storm, still like a blade waiting to drop. I walked to the safe, checked the timestamp again. It matched. My hands didn't shake. My breath didn't quicken. I'd planned for this, every bit of it, not because I expected the betrayal, but because I'd worked in enough boardrooms to know it was always a possibility, and because the real power isn't yelling the loudest. It's knowing where the fuse is and when to light it. I poured a fresh cup of coffee, sat back down, and waited for the first spark. The first cracks appeared just after midnight. Warehouse 3 BTK's overnight sync didn't complete, which meant East Coast orders were routed through a non-priority channel. That alone wasn't catastrophic. Glitches happened. But then the fallback protocol failed too. By 2:17 a.m., the routing queue had tripled. Dispatch logs showed packages being duplicated, misassigned, or, in one case, rerouted to a decommissioned fulfillment center that had been turned into a vape warehouse 2 years ago. By 4 a.m., tickets flooded into IT. Someone rebooted the Nexus Flow dashboard. The server logs showed the pretty front end was still trying to pull data from a now inaccessible table. Panic rose. No one could get a clean error report. Nothing was syncing. APIs were timing out. The weekend patch had overwritten a dependency my team built 3 years ago because the new devs thought it was unused legacy bloat. Except it wasn't unused. It was hidden, siloed, firewalled from their circus of a rollout. On purpose, the only people who ever had access to those nodes were me and my team, who, at this point, were silent. I didn't answer the first email, or the Slack ping, or the 7:12 a.m. voicemail from one of Lacey's workflow experience managers, who sounded like he was on the verge of tears. Something about unresponsive vendors and escalating investor concern. I sat in my kitchen, sipped my coffee, stirred in exactly 1 spoon of powdered creamer, and opened the window. The morning air was sharp, cleansing. Let them sweat. Let them feel what it's like to ask questions into the void. By 9 a.m., Ops was in full tailspin. Procurement queues weren't clearing. One of the automated invoice bots started issuing refunds on unfulfilled orders because it thought everything was backlogged 2 weeks, was tied to a timestamping module Nexus Flow, had deprecated without understanding. It also verified service-level compliance for 3 states with specific regulation laws. Someone tried to roll back the update, but they didn't have rollback permissions, because rollback permissions lived in an offline node, because that node's security keys were registered to an internal trust that, as of last night, no longer recognized them as authorized. Clause 14.1c wasn't just a landmine, it was a map rewriter. Legal hadn't realized it yet, but the systems Lacey thought she'd sunset weren't destroyed or overwritten. They'd been transferred, isolated, legally protected. We never deleted the infrastructure. We just ghosted it, siloed our modules behind dual-auth protocols, and routed them through service shells no one in Lacey's team even knew existed. Why? Because this wasn't the first regime change I'd survived, and because flashy isn't the same as functional. I'd learned long ago that you don't kill off a system just because it doesn't look cute on a mood board. You quarantine it, you layer it, you bake in clauses and keys and levers, then wait. Not out of malice, out of prudence. So when they came for my tools with their Canva slides and whiteboard slogans, I didn't panic. I documented, I archived, I stepped back. Now I watched. IT sent another email, urgent, legacy system recovery assistance required. I flagged it, didn't open it, let them dig. Let them call vendors, reboot dashboards, scream into their headsets on 14 Zoom calls per hour. None of it would work, because the data structures weren't broken. They were locked, from the inside, with a key only I could provide if I felt generous. I wasn't, not yet, because this wasn't just about broken dashboards or missed SLAs. This was about respect, about the cost of dismissing competence as inconvenient, about what happens when you take the one person keeping the train on the tracks and throw them under it. And as I watched the logs cascade in my private admin panel, timeouts, alerts, fallbacks spinning in circles, I felt nothing but cold clarity. The fire had started. Now they'd see what happens when the match they struck lights the wrong fuse. The legal team didn't know where to look at first. They started with the usual panic protocol: pull recent change logs, blame third-party vendors, escalate to IT. Someone tried to convene an emergency alignment pod. Another launched a root cause task force. Meanwhile, fulfillment was hemorrhaging. Compliance audits were slipping past redline, and 2 investor representatives requested a forensic report on infrastructure governance. That's when legal really started sweating. By mid-afternoon, 2 junior counsels and an assistant GC were holed up in a glass fishbowl conference room, scrubbing operations contracts for anything, that would explain why they suddenly had no legal jurisdiction over the very systems they claimed to modernize. Nothing was working, because nothing they'd built was real infrastructure. It was scaffolding, flashy wrappers on hollow shells. Then someone found it. Clause 14.1c. Tucked inside a vendor migration agreement signed 2 years ago when we brought hosting back in-house to reduce cloud overages. Back then, I had full latitude to handle infrastructure as I saw fit. So I worked with procurement, legal, and a sleepy IT compliance auditor to quietly structure the clause in plain language. If any critical operational modules, tools, or systems under the domain of the Office of Infrastructure are materially deprecated, reassigned, or externally migrated without formal technical sign-off and documentation from said office, administrative ownership of those systems shall revert, in full, to the controlling entity listed in Appendix C. Appendix C, Clear Hill Systems Trust. My trust. There it was. I could imagine the GC's face when she hit that paragraph, that slow-rolling horror you feel when you realize the fire alarm wasn't a drill, and that you, personally, wired the building wrong 2 years ago. The kicker: the clause wasn't contingent on intent. It was triggered by event, a code deployment, an access log. A single system pushed out of scope without my sign-off, and it had happened dozens of times. Silently, repeatedly, all logged, all time-stamped. But the real death blow was what happened on the investor call, because the clause had a verification condition, an activation, not just passive inheritance. And that envelope I held up, that was the notarized trigger. It had been pre-filled, date-agnostic, certified, and filed under Clearhill's trust archive. It only needed a time of activation, a sign of breach, and an instigating event. Lacey muting me mid-sentence, on record, in direct response to me citing a compliance issue. That wasn't just bad optics. It was the trigger. I'd updated the envelope the night before, slid the time-stamped copy into the Clearhill safe, then mirrored it to an offline node that uploaded a duplicate to our third-party legal service the moment I pressed the mute button. The legal team found that too, once they knew where to look. They also found the compliance logs I'd been quietly saving. Every system change, every overwritten module, every attempt to route around Ops Core by people who didn't know the foundation they were standing on had its own silent insurance policy. Suddenly, the entire digital ecosystem of the company, fulfillment, vendor interfaces, logistics, compliance mapping, was no longer theirs to control. It wasn't ransomware. It wasn't sabotage. It wasn't even hostile. It was pre-signed, pre-approved, legally validated reversion. They'd pulled the trigger, just provided the clause. At 5:14 p.m., the GC sent a confidential memo to the board titled Operational Clause Violation, Immediate Review Required. I wasn't copied, but I saw it, because one of the associate counsels, a woman I trained during her first month, sent me a text. They found it. Holy SHT. You wrote the rules they're drowning in. I didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, I logged into the ClearHill dashboard, confirmed that reversion was fully executed, and updated the access audit to read. Status, triggered by Event 14.1c. Recovery, negotiation required. Then I poured a drink, not in celebration, but as a prelude, because the revelation was only phase 1. Now they'd come to terms with what they'd lost. Next, they'd find out what it would cost to get it back. By sunrise, the shipping dashboards weren't just sluggish, they were blank. Fulfillment Center 2D logged 712 orders with no matching inventory tags. Warehouse 6A printed duplicate labels for parcels that didn't exist. And one major vendor partner, Blue Grain Logistics, the one with the tightest SLA in the stack, issued a formal notification of breach, citing sustained failure to provide accurate dispatch data within contractually agreed timelines. That's lawyer speak for, you're blowing it. We're about to charge triple. Meanwhile, the customer support queue hit a record high, with irate buyers demanding to know why tracking links were bouncing to 404 pages and why their prepaid 2-day deliveries now read, pending inventory sync. Spoiler, there was no sync, because Nexus Flow didn't know how to talk to the ghost systems it had tried to bury, and the ghost systems had stopped answering the door. IT was melting down, cycled through blame like a broken vending machine, first the cloud platform, then the data warehouse vendor, then a possible DNS poisoning event. It wasn't until some poor sleep-deprived engineer realized their API handoff was silently looping through a deprecated test environment that they started to understand they weren't in a bug, they were in a bypass. And I still hadn't said a word. Not to Lacey, not to legal, not to the board. I just watched. 9:44 a.m. An intern on the finance team, God bless interns, cross-referenced an outdated infrastructure invoice from 2 fiscal years ago with a current license registry. And there it was. Several core modules, Ops Core, Route Weaver, and Fulfill Logic, were still licensed to ClearHill systems, which meant that every system they'd been trying to overwrite was never truly theirs. Even better, ClearHill contract came with usage restrictions. No sublicensing, no reconfiguration, and no deprecation without an engineering rollback plan co-signed by the original implementation lead. Which, surprise, was me. And guess what didn't exist in Lacey's glitter-stained paper trail? Any rollback plan, any cosign, any trace of technical documentation at all, unless you count a Canva slide that said Ops reimagined in bubble font. By noon, investors were calling, not emailing, not texting, calling. 2 had already scheduled emergency audits. One, more old school, asked for a printout of the current system compliance map. I would have laughed if it wasn't so predictable, because there was no map. They'd burned it the moment they pushed my team out and declared legacy systems obsolete. Meanwhile, someone leaked internal Slack messages. And oh, did they burn. There it was, plain as daylight. Screenshots of Lacey brushing off engineering flags from my team weeks ago. Susan's being dramatic again. It's fine. Just push the rollout, we'll fix the bugs after. Legacy folks always panic when we innovate. Legacy folks, innovate. It was arrogance dressed up in disruptor drag. And now that same arrogance was costing them 6 figures per hour in failed contracts and SLA penalties. Still, I didn't gloat, didn't posture. Because this wasn't about revenge. This was about precision. I had prepared for this, not out of malice, but because I knew what happened when the wrong people took the wheel and ignored the signs. And they ignored every single one. So I sat back in my kitchen, laptop open but untouched, while the entire ops org flailed in the quicksand they poured themselves into. The inbox notifications buzzed. Slack DMs piled up. Voicemails rolled in. All ignored, because they still didn't understand the most critical. I didn't have to hack anything. I didn't crash their systems. I just left. And they found out the hard way that when you silence the person who wrote the blueprint, you better hope you know how to rebuild it from scratch. They didn't. The word sabotage hit the call like a dead bird against glass. Lacey dropped it mid-rant during an emergency sync with legal, finance, and whatever was left of the ops org that hadn't fled for stress leave or Wi-Fi black spots. Voice had climbed an octave since the day before, shaky, defensive, laced with fake calm. "We're clearly dealing with a coordinated obstruction campaign," she said, eyes darting across the screen. "This isn't normal system degradation. Someone is doing this." Silence followed. No one nodded. No one agreed. Because everyone on that call had finally put the pieces together. This wasn't someone doing something. This was the direct result of someone not doing what they were told. Being right, that someone was me, and I still hadn't spoken. Then, softly like a knife slipped under a rib, General Counsel Marla leaned toward her camera and said it. "Lacey," she whispered, that envelope Susan held up on the investor call, "was that activation?" Lacey blinked. "What envelope?" Marla didn't blink. A junior counsel, probably up to his eyeballs in doc review, unmuted just long enough to say, "Clause 14.1c includes a physical notarization clause." Susan had an envelope on camera. "The timestamp matches our logs." Lacey laughed. It came out dry and wrong. That envelope could have been anything. How do we know it was even real? What if she planned this? What if this is retaliation? You don't understand. She's been hostile since the beginning. She tried to tank the transition. She, Lacey. Marla didn't raise her voice. The authority in it was unmistakable. "Stop." Lacey froze. On screen, finance looked like they wanted to melt into their chairs. Ops was stone-faced. Marla continued, measured, calm. "What you're describing isn't sabotage. It's a clause. A clause you triggered repeatedly by bypassing technical sign-off, reassigning systems, and actively muting the person responsible for infrastructure during a live compliance discussion." Lacey flinched. She was being disruptive. Silenced her. Marla's tone didn't change on a call with investors while she was raising a compliance concern. Lacey opened her mouth again, but no words came. Marla turned slightly off-screen, typing. A few beats later, Board Secretary Elaine appeared in the Zoom gallery, lips pressed thin. The email went out seconds later. Subject line, request for private consultation, Susan Kramer, not internal escalation. Not disciplinary review, not even containment. It was an invitation, and not from Lacey, from the board. Because they finally realized what the investors had sniffed out faster than anyone. This wasn't a case of technical failure or internal politics. This was a contractual shift of power, and I'd done nothing wrong. In fact, I'd followed the rules better than anyone in that entire circus. I documented, filed, co-signed, and archived. The clause, approved, the trust, legally binding. The systems, contained under their original governance policies. It wasn't sabotage. It was succession. Meanwhile, Lacey had ignored security audits, silenced compliance warnings, reassigned protected systems without consultation, and then tried to rebrand it all as agile transformation. But you can't spin paper trails, especially when they're notarized and time-stamped. I didn't dance on her downfall. I didn't even log into the emergency channel where they were flailing. I simply watched my phone buzz, read the meeting invite, and marked it on my calendar. No reply, not yet. I wasn't angry. I was ready. Because this wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about leverage. And they'd finally realized who had it. The call came at 6:12 a.m. sharp. Not from Lacey, of course. She'd been sidelined the night before after a board-only session that didn't include her, followed by a single-line Slack message sent to the entire executive channel. Lacey C. Suspended pending formal review. Effective immediately. No signature, no flourish, just silence. The voice on the phone belonged to Marla from legal. Polite, professional, tired. She didn't grovel, that wasn't her style, but she chose her words carefully, like she was diffusing a bomb with trembling fingers. "Susan," she said, "the board would appreciate a dialogue. If you're open to it, let the quiet stretch for a few seconds. Not out of spite, just out of balance." After everything, I figured silence had earned its place in the room. "I'm listening," I finally said. They asked if I could help, if I'd consider re-engaging short-term limited scope. Not out of loyalty, out of necessity. Everything was still burning. 2/3 of logistics still offline. 3 lawsuits pending over service failure. Their recovery playbook was blank. I've drafted a proposal. They said they didn't expect that. Marla asked if it was actionable. It's not a proposal, I clarified. It's a package, and it was. Fully documented, thoroughly annotated, legally sound. Compliance keys, rollback procedures, sync maps, routing diagnostics, vendor liaison scripts, everything they needed to unf the catastrophe they'd authored. But it wasn't free. The price? Immediate reinstatement of my team under independent contract, indemnity from future infrastructure blame, retroactive to the beginning of the year. Direct access to board-level compliance channels for any future vendor transitions, and a non-negotiable fee, 7 figures, wired to Clearhill Systems, due within 48 hours of recovery launch. They didn't blink, because they couldn't afford to. They said the board would review it and respond formally by end of day. They didn't wait that long. By 9:43 a.m., I had a confirmation. The fee was approved, the indemnity granted, the recovery underway. Then came the cherry on top, an offer, executive title, full seat at the table, EVP of Infrastructure and Compliance Strategy, 7% equity vesting, personal assistant, a new vision. I stared at the email. It was perfectly worded, very official, and so painfully late. I thought about the meetings I'd been cut out of, younger employees who'd watched me get sidelined for not fitting the new energy. The way they muted me with a smirk like I was an HR inconvenience instead of the last line of defense. I hit reply. Typed one line, appreciate the offer, declining. My role was never executive. It was foundational. Then I hit send, because I didn't want a seat at the table. I wanted them to remember what happens when you rip out the floorboards and forget who built them. Control wasn't a title, it was leverage. And now, finally, it was mine. The boardroom lights were already on when I joined the call. 6:00 a.m. sharp. Everyone was there. Bleary-eyed, suit-jacketed, one guy clearly dialing in from the back seat of a car. Desperation hung in the air like recycled conference coffee. The background hum of failure was loud enough to drown out their greetings, which were polite, if noticeably subdued. They didn't waste time. Systems are still locked, the CTO said, his voice clipped. We've restored partial view-only access through sandbox nodes, but core functions remain restricted. Fulfillment's offline. Compliance hasn't validated a single export since Thursday. The compliance officer chimed in, visibly pale. We have 3 hours until 2 critical deadlines hit. If we miss them, the financial penalties escalate automatically. Escrow locks, insurance lapses, could trigger a full regulatory audit. The CFO spoke next, slower. We've approved your terms. The transfer to Clearhill Systems is already processing. Legal has acknowledged receipt of indemnity and contract amendments. We understand the clause now. Fully, I nodded. No joy, no fury, just resolution. Then I opened the binder on my desk. Inside, one sheet. The original clause, the notarized activation, and a single, highlighted sentence. I looked directly at the camera. No flourish. No warning. Then I read it. In the event of procedural breach without formal review, all operational access shall transfer to the named entity and will remain under their exclusive control until such time as the original party deems recovery conditions satisfied. And with that, I closed the binder. And the call, click. 1 hour later, my Clearhill Systems account pinged. Funds received, 7 figures. Verified. Logs came back to life. Access points unfroze. The routing modules synced. Everything snapped back into place like the world exhaling after a long, stupid panic. I didn't watch it happen, didn't hover over dashboards like a proud mechanic. I already knew it would work. I'd built it for resilience, for moments just like this. I closed my laptop. The quiet was deafening, but not empty, it was peace. Earned, not given. I stood, stretched, poured a fresh coffee. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but the edge of light was creeping over the skyline. In the soft glow of my kitchen, my phone buzzed 3 times. 3 offers. One from a rival firm that had quietly tried to poach me 3 years ago and now sent a subject line that simply read, "We were wrong. Let's talk." 2 from board members, individually, off the record. The irony made me smile, not because I wanted the jobs, but because now they wanted me. I no longer needed them. On the wall above my desk, where a bland watercolor used to hang, now sat a new frame. Clean, minimal, inside that plain envelope. Opened, flattened, timestamp visible. Proof of what it had always been, not a threat. A promise. And underneath it, handwritten in black ink, the final line I would ever say on their system. Next time, don't mute the person holding the keys. Big thanks, you legends of the old office days. Subscribe to keep the switch flicking chaos alive. Your ex-boss is shaking in their loafers.